The story unfolds within the world of John Wick and opens with a young girl named Eve sitting in a hospital. Blood stains her clothes as she quietly stares at a music box, watching a tiny ballerina twirl endlessly inside. The scene then shifts into the past. Before tragedy entered her life, Eve lived peacefully with her father, Javier. He spent time teaching her ballet and often complimented her talent. During one practice session, he remarks that she moves very much like her sister once did. The comment means little to Eve, however, because she has no memory of having a sister at all. Later that evening, Eve relaxes in her bedroom, mesmerized by the spinning dancer inside her treasured music box. Meanwhile, Javier, whose tattoo-covered body hints at a dangerous past, prepares for the night. Unbeknownst to them, danger is already closing in. Several armed strangers silently emerge from nearby water and begin infiltrating the property. One after another, the guards stationed around the house are eliminated without raising alarm. It doesn't take long for Javier to realize something is wrong. The moment he detects the intruders, he reacts instantly. Refusing to surrender, he launches a fierce defense and throws a smoke grenade to disrupt their advance. At the same time, he rushes to Eve and orders her to hide in her secret safe place. He makes it clear that no matter what happens, she must not come out. Frightened but trusting her father, she obeys. Javier then throws himself fully into the fight. His skills are exceptional, allowing him to hold off wave after wave of attackers, but numbers eventually overwhelm talent. Despite his efforts, he is finally subdued and taken prisoner. Soon afterward, the man commanding the operation arrives. Known as the Chancellor, he confronts Javier face to face. He reminds him that their organization once accepted him as family and even allowed him to marry the daughter of their clan. In the Chancellor's eyes, Javier repaid that trust with betrayal. He also places responsibility for his wife's death on Javier's shoulders. As the conversation continues, it becomes clear that their true objective is not Javier, it is Eve. The Chancellor then presents a cruel ultimatum. He places a gun containing a single bullet into Javier's hand. If Javier chooses to end his own life, Eve will be spared. If he instead uses the weapon against the Chancellor, both he and his daughter will be executed. Javier wrestles with the impossible decision. After a painful moment of reflection, he raises the gun and appears ready to sacrifice himself. But before he can act, a sudden scream echoes through the room. Eve has been secretly watching everything. Her cry immediately reveals her location. The Chancellor wastes no time leaving, while Javier abandons all thought of surrender and resumes fighting. Fueled by desperation, he tears through the remaining attackers with renewed determination. For a while, he seems unstoppable. Eventually, however, one surviving enemy manages to overpower him and pins him down, preparing to deliver the killing blow. Watching her father's life slip away, Eve notices a fallen weapon nearby. She grabs it, and before she can second-guess herself, fires. The attacker collapses dead. During the chaos, she briefly notices an unusual symbol marked on the man's hand. Father and daughter seize the opportunity to escape. Their flight, however, comes at a terrible cost. Javier is struck by gunfire and badly wounded. Knowing their pursuers are still behind them, he hurls an explosive device into the house. Moments later, a massive blast tears through the building, destroying it and killing everyone still inside. For the first time that night, they are free from pursuit, but safety arrives too late. Javier's injuries prove fatal, and despite Eve's desperate hope, he dies before help can reach them. Devastated and alone, she is left with nothing but grief. The story returns to the hospital, where the blood-covered Eve still clutches her memories and stares silently at her music box. It is there that a man named Winston approaches her. As the owner of New York's Continental Hotel, he understands more about her father than she realizes. Winston gently tells Eve that Javier was a good man who wanted something rare in their world, a normal life for his daughter. He admits he cannot erase her suffering, but he can ensure she is not left alone. He promises to bring her to Javier's people, where she will be cared for. True to his word, Winston takes Eve to the Ruska Roma, a secretive organization that disguises itself as a dance academy while training elite assassins behind closed doors. There she meets the director, who asks a simple question: can she dance? Eve confidently says yes. The director responds by telling her that they will teach her how to transform her anger into strength. The people responsible for her father's death may have taken much from her, but they do not deserve to take her future as well. Before departing, Winston hands Eve a special coin and assures her that she will always have his support. With that promise made, he leaves her in the care of the Ruska Roma. Soon afterward, Eve is introduced to an instructor named Nogi. He explains that Javier once belonged to their ranks and carried the title of Kikimora. According to legend, a Kikimora is a spirit associated with darkness, yet one capable of protecting the innocent when necessary. The title carries both fear and honor. 12 years pass. Eve is no longer a frightened child. She has devoted herself entirely to training. During one intense ballet session, she pushes herself so hard that her feet begin to bleed. Even then, she refuses to slow down. Her friend Tatiana notices the damage and urges her to rest, but Eve ignores the advice. She is determined to become a kikimora and refuses to let anything stand in her way. Ballet is only one part of her education. She spends years mastering firearms, learning how to move unseen, and sharpening her combat abilities. The training is relentless. She suffers countless defeats, especially against larger and stronger opponents. Whenever she struggles, Nogi pushes her harder. He teaches her that skill alone is not enough. She must fight with complete commitment, regardless of the odds. Gradually, her dedication begins to pay off. The losses become victories. The mistakes become lessons. Year after year, Eve grows stronger until she eventually earns recognition as the finest student within the Ruska Roma. Then, one day, something unexpected happens. Tatiana suddenly disappears without explanation. Concerned and unable to ignore the mystery, Eve seeks out the director herself, determined to learn what became of her friend. The director explains that Tatiana was never suited for the life they led. Unlike Eve, she lacked the ruthless determination required to survive in their world, which is why she eventually left. Hearing this only strengthens Eve's resolve. Confident in her abilities, she announces that she is ready to earn the title of Kikimora. The director decides there is one final challenge standing between Eve and that goal. Not long afterward, Eve is escorted into a training chamber where another woman is waiting. This opponent has spent a decade working as an assassin and is far from inexperienced. The rules of the test are straightforward. Both women are given identical weapon parts and a single bullet. They must assemble the firearm, load it, and eliminate the other person before being killed themselves. The moment the challenge begins, both competitors move with incredible speed. Hands fly across the table as the weapons come together piece by piece. It becomes a race measured in seconds. Although the veteran assassin works efficiently, Eve proves even faster. Before her opponent can finish preparing her weapon, Eve chambers the round, takes aim, and fires. The shot lands cleanly, ending the contest instantly. Later that evening, Eve notices an unexpected visitor inside the Ruska Roma headquarters. The legendary John Wick has come to speak with the director. Intrigued, Eve approaches him after their meeting. Looking at the infamous assassin standing before her, she asks if he is truly the Baba Yaga she has heard so much about. John calmly confirms that he is. Eve then asks the question that has been on her mind. She wants to know how she can become someone like him. Instead of offering advice, John studies her for a moment. Having experienced the cost of this life himself, he feels sympathy for her. Rather than encouraging her ambitions, he quietly tells her to walk away while she still can. According to him, there is still time to choose a different future. Some time passes, and Eve finally receives her first official assignment. A wealthy and influential man fears that his daughter may be targeted by kidnappers seeking a ransom. Eve's task is simple: keep the young woman safe. Armed with a pistol loaded with non-lethal rubber rounds, she heads to a crowded nightclub where the girl is spending the evening. Inside, the atmosphere is loud and chaotic. Music shakes the walls while people crowd the dance floor. Eve quickly identifies her target and begins monitoring her movements from a distance. Everything appears normal at first. Then several men wearing suits start moving toward the young woman. Their behavior immediately raises alarms. Realizing trouble is seconds away, Eve springs into action. She intercepts the men before they can reach their target, triggering a violent confrontation. The attackers outnumber her significantly, and the fight starts badly. Surrounded from multiple directions, Eve is forced onto the defensive. However, years of brutal training begin to show. She adapts quickly, striking vulnerable points and using precise techniques to neutralize one opponent after another. In the middle of the chaos, she spots the group's leader attempting to drag the girl away. Refusing to let him escape, Eve charges after him. While pursuing him, she grabs an ice axe she finds nearby and turns it into a deadly weapon. What follows is a savage struggle. Eve relentlessly attacks, refusing to give her opponent a chance to recover. Blow after blow lands until the man finally collapses and remains motionless. With the leader dead and the rest of the attackers defeated, the kidnapping attempt is stopped and the young woman is saved. After successfully completing the mission, Eve officially earns the title she has worked toward for years. As part of the initiation, she receives a tattoo matching the one her father once carried. The mark serves as a permanent symbol of her commitment. From this point forward, there is no returning to an ordinary life. The story then moves ahead by 2 months. Eve is shown cleaning and treating fresh injuries in a bathroom after finishing another contract. Despite the bruises and cuts covering her body, she appears unfazed. When she checks her phone, she sees a substantial payment has been transferred to her account as compensation for eliminating her assigned target. Once she leaves the building and starts driving away, her routine trip is interrupted without warning. Another vehicle suddenly attacks her. The ambush forces Eve into a dangerous gunfight. Bullets fly as she desperately tries to survive. After a tense exchange of fire, she eventually gains the upper hand and kills her attacker. When the fight is over, she examines the body more closely. What she discovers sends a chill through her. The dead man's hand bears the exact same mysterious symbol she remembers from the night her father was murdered. Determined to uncover the truth, Eve later visits the director and presents a severed hand taken from the attacker. Pointing to the strange mark, she explains that she saw the same symbol years ago on one of the men responsible for killing Javier. She demands answers. The director recognizes the emblem immediately and becomes serious. Eve insists that she wants revenge, but the director warns her that she has no idea what she is dealing with. According to her, those who carry the cross-shaped mark operate outside every known system of rules. They answer to no authority and obey no established code. Their organization predates even the Ruska Roma itself. They belong to an ancient order with influence stretching far beyond what most people can imagine. Most importantly, they are enemies best left alone. The warning does little to discourage Eve. Still searching for information, she travels to New York and visits the Continental Hotel, where Winston welcomes her. The two exchange a few words before Eve finally brings up the symbol and the people connected to her father's death. At first, Winston avoids the subject, but Eve reminds him of the promise he made years ago. She shows him the special coin he gave her as a child, forcing him to honor his word. Realizing he can no longer stay silent, Winston finally reveals what he knows. The people carrying the mark belong to a secretive cult-like network that operates without allegiance to any nation. Their reach extends across borders, yet their true headquarters remain unknown. Very few people possess reliable information about them. However, Winston does have one lead. A man named Daniel Pine, who is connected to the organization, is currently staying at the Continental Hotel in Prague. Winston places a call and gathers additional information. He learns that Daniel already has an active bounty worth $2 million on his head and is occupying room 315. Armed with this lead, Eve thanks Winston and immediately leaves for Prague. Soon afterward, she arrives at the Prague Continental and checks into room 314, directly beside Daniel's. The hotel lobby is filled with assassins, many of whom have already taken notice of the bounty. Among them is a woman named Lena, who appears to be coordinating the hunt. Lena contacts a sniper positioned in a nearby building. From his vantage point, he has a clear view of Daniel's room. Not long later, the sniper spots Eve slipping inside room 315 and immediately reports the development. Inside the room, Eve finally comes face to face with Daniel. To her surprise, she discovers a young girl named Ella there as well. The child looks at Eve and innocently asks whether she has come to kill her father. The unexpected question briefly catches Eve off guard. That moment of distraction gives Daniel enough time to appear behind her with a gun drawn. Tension fills the room instantly. Eve quickly explains that she is not there to collect the bounty. She tells Daniel that she only wants information regarding the people responsible for her father's death and has no intention of harming him or his daughter. Elsewhere, the sniper informs Lena that no fighting is taking place and that the pair appear to be talking instead. Lena immediately reacts by increasing the reward on Daniel's head. The bounty doubles from $2 million to $4 million. The enormous payout attracts even more assassins, all eager to claim the prize. As news of the increase spreads through the hotel, armed killers begin converging on Daniel's room. Realizing the danger they are now facing, Daniel becomes furious and blames Eve for bringing unwanted attention to his location. The situation rapidly spirals out of control as heavily motivated assassins close in from every direction. Daniel finally explains the truth behind the situation. The organization isn't hunting him for money or revenge alone. They want his daughter, Ella. Years earlier, he chose to remove her from the cult's control and raise her far away from its influence. That decision turned him into a target. Before the conversation can continue, danger arrives. A group of assassins storms the area, forcing Daniel and Eve into action. The two fight side by side with remarkable efficiency, cutting through their attackers with the skills only elite killers possess. Amid the chaos, Daniel warns Eve that escaping the cult is nearly impossible. According to him, once someone belongs to them, there is no walking away alive. Knowing he may not survive much longer, Daniel makes Eve an offer. If she protects Ella, he will help her uncover everything she wants to know about the people connected to her father's death. Eve agrees without hesitation. Together, they attempt to flee, but their escape doesn't last long. Lena and her followers soon locate them, and it becomes clear that she and her team are members of the same cult Daniel has been describing. A fierce confrontation follows. During the battle, a man named Dex seemingly kills Daniel, leaving Eve without her most valuable source of information. At the same time, Lena overpowers Eve in a brutal fight, beating her into unconsciousness. With Eve neutralized and Daniel apparently dead, the cult succeeds in capturing Ella. Afterward, Lena contacts the Chancellor to report their success. While updating him, she mentions an unknown woman who nearly interfered with the operation and caused significant trouble. Elsewhere, Eve recovers and resumes her pursuit. Determined not to abandon her mission, she visits an arms dealer named Frank. Her goal is simple: acquire weapons and gather information. While selecting firearms, she begins questioning Frank about the cult and its whereabouts. The dealer clearly knows more than he wants to admit, but fear keeps him silent. He refuses to provide answers. The discussion is interrupted when several cult operatives suddenly break into the store. The attackers immediately target Eve, transforming the shop into a battlefield. Thinking quickly, Eve grabs a handful of grenades and uses them to devastating effect. Explosions tear through the building as she fights her way through the ambush. One by one, the attackers are eliminated until none remain standing. Witnessing her determination firsthand, Frank finally changes his mind. Realizing she won't stop until she finds answers, he provides her with a lead. According to rumors, the cult maintains a hidden stronghold somewhere in the mountains. However, he includes a warning. Anyone who has gone looking for the place has never come back. Eve accepts the information and heads out immediately. Not long into her journey, her phone rings. The director is on the other end of the line, and she is furious. She demands that Eve return at once. By pursuing the cult independently, she is risking more than her own life. Her actions could endanger the entire Ruska Roma organization and threaten a fragile balance that has existed for years. But Eve has come too far to turn back now. Ignoring the warning, she ends the call and continues toward her destination. Some time later, she arrives in the picturesque town of Hallstatt. At first glance, the village appears peaceful and ordinary. As Eve enters a small cafe, her attention is immediately drawn to something familiar, a music box featuring a spinning ballerina, nearly identical to the one she cherished as a child. The sight floods her with memories. She orders a coffee and tries to relax, but something feels wrong. The atmosphere inside the cafe is unusually tense. Conversations are scarce, and customers seem eager to leave. One by one, people quietly exit the building. Then everything explodes into action. A man suddenly rushes inside and attacks Eve without warning. Gunfire erupts throughout the cafe as the two exchange shots. Meanwhile, the waitress hurriedly makes a phone call, urgently requesting assistance from someone nearby. Eve eventually kills her attacker, but she knows more trouble is coming. She races upstairs in search of cover. There she encounters the waitress again. This time, the woman is holding a knife. Eve calmly tells her she doesn't want to hurt anyone, hoping to avoid another fight. The reassurance has no effect. The waitress immediately lunges at her. The attack is short-lived. Eve easily disarms the woman, restrains her, and locks her away. Unfortunately, that victory solves nothing. Outside, more people begin arriving, then even more, and more after that. It quickly becomes obvious that the entire town is connected to the cult. The situation grows even worse when the Chancellor's voice echoes through the village. Moments later, a siren sounds. The response is immediate. Armed residents emerge from every corner of Hallstatt. Men, women, elderly citizens, and even younger members of the community take up weapons and join the hunt. The seemingly peaceful town transforms into hostile territory. Eve fights relentlessly, refusing to surrender. She battles her way through wave after wave of opponents, but the odds become impossible. Exhaustion eventually catches up with her, and sheer numbers overwhelm her defenses. At last, she is captured. Soon afterward, Lena arrives to inspect the prisoner. While examining Eve, she notices the tattoo identifying her as a member of the Ruska Roma. The discovery immediately confirms her suspicions. Without saying much, Lena knocks Eve unconscious. Elsewhere, Ella is brought before the Chancellor. The old man speaks to her calmly and reveals an unexpected truth: he is her grandfather. He attempts to justify everything that has happened, claiming that Daniel betrayed the family and tried to take her away from her rightful place within the cult. Ella isn't interested in his explanations. Angry and frightened, she bluntly tells him that she hates him. Later, Eve regains consciousness. When her vision clears, she finds herself standing before the Chancellor. The old man begins questioning her while explaining the larger conflict at play. According to him, a long-standing peace agreement once existed between the cult and the Ruska Roma. That fragile arrangement kept both sides from interfering in each other's affairs. Now, because of Eve's actions, that peace is in danger of collapsing. Eve argues that everything she has done was her own choice and that the Ruska Roma had nothing to do with it. The Chancellor dismisses the distinction. From his perspective, the damage has already been done. During the conversation, another major revelation comes to light. The Chancellor admits that he personally placed the bounty on Daniel. His son had attempted to break away from generations of tradition by removing Ella from the cult, and the Chancellor considered that betrayal unforgivable. The confession enrages Eve. She accuses him of being responsible for her father's death years ago. For the first time, the Chancellor appears genuinely surprised. As he studies her more carefully, realization dawns on him. She is Javier's daughter. The discovery changes everything. The Chancellor steps away and privately speaks with Lena. What he reveals leaves her stunned. Eve is not merely an outsider. She is Lena's sister. Before Lena can fully process the revelation, chaos erupts. Eve suddenly launches a fierce counterattack, grabbing a weapon and opening fire. Several cult members fall before they can react. One of the men attempts to shoot her, but Lena unexpectedly turns her own weapon on him and kills him first. The hesitation gives Eve a chance to escape. She doesn't get far. Lena quickly catches up, and the two women clash in a fierce battle. Eventually, Eve gains the advantage and holds Lena at gunpoint. Rather than continuing the fight, Lena finally tells her the truth. She confirms that they are sisters. The revelation leaves Eve stunned. Lena explains that when their father fled with Eve, he betrayed the cult. Their mother suffered the consequences of that decision, paying a terrible price after he escaped. Eve refuses to accept the version of events being presented. She insists that Javier wasn't a traitor. In her eyes, he was simply a father trying to give his daughter the chance to live a normal life. Meanwhile, word reaches the Chancellor that the sisters have stopped fighting and are speaking to one another. The news infuriates him. Unwilling to risk reconciliation, he immediately orders both women eliminated. His followers obey without hesitation. Several grenades are thrown toward the sisters. The explosions tear through the area, leaving both women badly wounded. Barely able to move, Eve drags herself toward Lena through the wreckage. As they lie injured beside one another, Lena quietly shares one final truth. She reveals that she was only 9 years old when she was told her younger sister had died. For years, she believed that story without question. Now, after all this time, she has finally learned that it was a lie. With her strength fading, Lena begins sharing memories she has carried for years. Through tears, she tells Eve that not a single day passed without thinking about her lost sister. Believing Eve had died long ago, she spent her entire life mourning someone who was actually still alive. Moments later, Lena succumbs to her injuries. The loss hits Eve harder than anything she has experienced since her father's death. After finally discovering the family she never knew she had, it is taken away from her almost immediately. Grief quickly transforms into pure fury. Not long afterward, several cult fighters move in to finish her off. That proves to be a fatal mistake. Fueled by heartbreak and rage, Eve launches herself at them with terrifying intensity. Every strike is vicious, every shot deliberate. The attackers stand no chance. One after another, they fall before her relentless assault until the entire group is wiped out. After the battle, Eve picks up a walkie-talkie from one of the dead men. She contacts the Chancellor directly. Her message is simple and unmistakable. She tells him that she is coming for him and that she will not stop until he is dead. For the first time, the old leader seems genuinely shaken. Realizing how dangerous the situation has become, he immediately reaches out to the director of the Ruska Roma. Furious, he accuses her organization of violating the long-standing peace agreement between their two groups. The director firmly denies any involvement. She explains that Eve acted entirely on her own and that the Ruska Roma never authorized her actions. But the Chancellor has no interest in explanations. In his eyes, the distinction no longer matters. He declares that the entire Ruska Roma will suffer the consequences. Understanding the severity of the threat, the director offers a solution. She promises that Eve will be eliminated and that the conflict can end there. The Chancellor accepts the proposal. After obtaining Eve's location, the director decides to send only one person capable of carrying out the task with certainty. John Wick, meanwhile, the Chancellor broadcasts an order throughout the village. He instructs everyone to stay out of the conflict and allow the hunt to continue uninterrupted. Some time later, John finally arrives. The legendary assassin soon crosses paths with Eve among the snow-covered streets. Rather than attacking immediately, he gives her a choice. She can leave with him and survive, or she can continue down her current path and die. Eve doesn't hesitate. Her need for vengeance has consumed her completely, and she refuses to abandon her mission now that she is so close to its conclusion. Determined to press forward, she even attempts to attack John. Instead of retaliating, he studies her for a moment. Recognizing the same stubborn resolve that has defined his own life, John makes an unexpected decision. He grants her additional time. Midnight will be the deadline. She has 30 minutes to finish what she started. Once that time expires, he will no longer protect her from the consequences. Eve accepts the terms without argument. Soon afterward, word reaches the Chancellor that John allowed her to continue. The report infuriates him. Abandoning caution, he issues a new order across the entire settlement. Every resident is instructed to hunt Eve down and kill her before she can reach him. The village erupts into chaos. Eve responds by launching a direct assault. She moves from house to house, eliminating assassins with ruthless efficiency. Years of training, pain, and loss have forged her into a weapon, and now that weapon is pointed directly at the cult. Eventually, she reaches the settlement's armory. Inside are some of the most dangerous weapons available to the community. At the same time, waves of armed residents flood the streets. What follows is complete carnage. Eve uses every tool at her disposal. Guns thunder through the night. Explosives rip apart buildings. Fire spreads through the battlefield. Anyone standing between her and the Chancellor becomes a target. As the conflict escalates, several advisors urge the Chancellor to flee. They warn him that the situation is deteriorating rapidly and that remaining in place is no longer safe. The Chancellor refuses. According to him, no leader in Hallstatt's two-century history has ever abandoned their post in a time of crisis. He has no intention of becoming the first. Elsewhere, Eve acquires a flamethrower and unleashes devastation on the attackers pursuing her. Streams of fire sweep through the battlefield, forcing enemies to retreat or perish. Amid the destruction, a familiar threat emerges: Dex. As one of the cult's deadliest operatives, he quickly proves to be a far more dangerous opponent than the others. The confrontation becomes one of the toughest battles Eve has faced. Dex lands several brutal attacks, severely injuring her. Then he reveals a flamethrower of his own. The fight transforms into a terrifying duel of fire. Massive streams of flame collide as both combatants unleash everything they have. The surrounding area becomes an inferno. Despite her determination, Eve gradually loses ground. Dex corners her. Injured, exhausted, and trapped, she appears to have reached the end. Just as Dex prepares to finish her, a gunshot rings out. John Wick has arrived. Without hesitation, he fires directly at Dex's flamethrower. The fuel ignites instantly, triggering a massive explosion that kills the assassin on the spot. Unfortunately, the shot exposes John's position. Nearby cult members immediately redirect their attention toward him. It is a terrible decision. The legendary Baba Yaga quickly reminds everyone why his name inspires fear across the underworld. The attackers rush him from every direction, only to be cut down with effortless precision. While John keeps the cult occupied, events elsewhere reach their climax. The Chancellor attempts to escape with Ella. Believing the battle lost, he loads his granddaughter into a vehicle and prepares to flee. But Eve has one final surprise waiting for him. She intercepts the car and opens fire. The vehicle crashes violently, bringing the escape attempt to an abrupt end. The Chancellor emerges from the wreckage and confronts her one last time. Knowing he has little chance of surviving, he tries a different approach. He argues that killing him will solve nothing. According to him, countless followers remain loyal to the cult. Even if he dies, others will continue hunting her for the rest of her life. Eve has no interest in listening. After everything she has lost, there is only one thing left to do. She raises her weapon. A single shot echoes through the air. The bullet strikes perfectly. The Chancellor collapses, dead before he hits the ground. At long last, the man responsible for so much suffering is gone. When the fighting finally ends, Eve finds Ella and ensures that she is safe. Together, they walk away from the destruction that has consumed the village. Elsewhere, John contacts the director. His report is brief. The Chancellor is dead. Some time later, another surprise is revealed. Daniel survived. Though badly injured, he is recovering in a hospital where he is reunited with Ella. Father and daughter finally share a peaceful moment after everything they have endured. Meanwhile, Eve arrives at the Continental. There, Winston speaks with her about what comes next. He warns her that defeating the Chancellor does not mean the danger is over. She may have eliminated the head of the organization, but the rest of it still exists. In Winston's words, removing the snake's head does not kill the entire serpent. Eve also learns that her actions have come with consequences. The Ruska Roma has officially cast her out. No longer welcome among the people who raised and trained her, she must now walk her own path. Later, she quietly attends a theater performance. From the audience, she watches Tatiana dance on stage, taking a rare moment to reflect on everything that has happened. But peace never lasts long in this world. Only moments later, a new contract is issued. Across the assassin network, news spreads rapidly. A bounty worth $5 million has been placed on Eve's head. As fate would have it, Eve receives the notification herself. The message confirms what Winston already warned her about. Her battle is far from over. Without wasting a second, she leaves the theater and disappears into the night, preparing for whatever comes next. The film closes on that ominous note, making it clear that while one chapter has ended, a far more dangerous one is only beginning. Before getting into whether Ballerina actually works as a movie, I think the first thing that needs to be talked about is where this film sits within the John Wick universe, because that's honestly a huge part of the conversation. This isn't a reboot, it isn't some alternate take on the franchise, and it's definitely not trying to replace John Wick. The movie very deliberately places itself inside the existing timeline, somewhere between the events of Chapter 3 and Chapter 4. So from the very beginning, it wants you to understand that this is still the same world, the same rules, the same shadowy network of assassins, crime families, secret alliances, and strange traditions that the franchise has been building for years. And that's probably one of the film's biggest challenges. The moment you attach the words, from the world of John Wick, to a movie, audiences don't walk in with normal expectations anymore. They're not judging it as just another action film. They're comparing every scene, every character, every fight, and every story decision to a franchise that has spent nearly a decade building an incredibly loyal fanbase. That's a tough position for any spin-off. What's interesting, though, is that Ballerina doesn't spend much time explaining how this universe works. It assumes that a lot of viewers already know what the Continental is, who the Ruska Roma are, and why certain characters carry so much weight whenever they appear on screen. The movie doesn't constantly stop to introduce terminology or give lengthy exposition dumps. In some ways, that's refreshing. It treats the audience like they've been here before. At the same time, that approach can be a bit of a double-edged sword. If you followed the John Wick films, you'll probably settle into this world almost immediately. The locations, the atmosphere, the familiar faces, even the way people speak to one another, it all feels connected to what came before. There's very little confusion about where this story belongs. But if someone walked into Ballerina without much experience with the franchise, I can see moments where they'd feel like they're arriving halfway through a conversation that's already been going on for years. That's not necessarily a flaw, it's just the kind of movie this is. What I found myself thinking about throughout the film wasn't whether it belonged in the John Wick universe. It clearly does. The real question was whether the universe itself could support stories that aren't centered around John Wick, because that's the experiment happening here. For the first time, the franchise is asking audiences to invest in someone else's journey while still operating under the enormous shadow of its most iconic character. That's a much harder balancing act than it sounds. Fans love this world, but they also love John Wick specifically. Those aren't always the same thing, and Ballerina spends a lot of its runtime trying to figure out where it stands between those two realities. Sometimes it feels like a confident expansion of the universe. Other times it feels very aware that it's borrowing credibility from the franchise around it. But regardless of where you land on the film itself, I do think it's an important entry for the series because it's testing something the franchise eventually had to test. Can the John Wick universe survive without John Wick being the center of attention? That's really the question hanging over this entire movie from start to finish. One thing that kept coming up while I was watching Ballerina had nothing to do with the action, the story, or even Ana de Armas. It was the question hanging over the movie before it ever reached theaters. Would people actually show up for a John Wick movie without John Wick being the main attraction? Because whether anyone wants to admit it or not, that's the gamble this film was always making. The John Wick franchise has reached a strange point. On one hand, the world has become incredibly recognizable. Mention the Continental, the gold coins, the high table, and most fans instantly know what you're talking about. The universe has grown far beyond the original movie. But on the other hand, a lot of people don't necessarily love the universe itself. They love John Wick. There's a difference. You can build all the mythology you want, introduce new assassins, new factions, new secret societies, but eventually audiences make a choice. Are they invested in the world, or are they invested in the guy walking through that world with a pencil and a death stare? Ballerina feels like the franchise testing that theory in real time. And honestly, I understand why some viewers were hesitant. For years, these movies have been sold around Keanu Reeves. His presence became the identity of the franchise. Even when the plots got bigger and the mythology got stranger, he remained the center of gravity, holding everything together. Now suddenly you're asking audiences to buy a ticket for a story where somebody else is carrying that responsibility. That's not impossible. Plenty of franchises have successfully expanded beyond their original lead characters, but it does create a challenge right away. The movie has to convince people that this world is interesting enough to stand on its own. Sometimes Ballerina succeeds at that. Sometimes it feels like it's still trying to prove it. What's fascinating is that you can almost feel that tension inside the movie itself. There are moments where it seems completely confident in Eve as the lead. Then there are other moments where it feels like the film is looking over its shoulder, checking to make sure the audience hasn't forgotten what franchise they're watching. That push and pull becomes part of the viewing experience, and I think that's why reactions ended up being so divided. Some viewers were excited simply because they wanted more stories from this universe. For them, the idea of exploring different corners of the assassin world was enough. Others seemed to approach the movie from the opposite direction. Their question wasn't, can this world support another character? It was, why would I watch this instead of another John Wick movie? That's a much harder question to answer. Because once a franchise becomes associated with a specific actor to this extent, every spin-off ends up being judged against a version of the movie that exists only in people's heads. The comparison starts before the opening scene even begins. And honestly, I think Ballerina was fighting that battle from day one, not because audiences disliked Ana de Armas. Most people seem to agree she's a strong screen presence. The issue is that replacing the central figure of a franchise is never the same as introducing a new character. Those are completely different challenges. What makes Ballerina interesting isn't just whether it's good or bad. It's that the movie feels like a test case. A test of whether audiences are willing to spend time in this universe when the legendary assassin isn't the one driving the story. And regardless of where people land on the film itself, that's probably the most important question the franchise is facing going forward. So once you get past all the franchise expectations and the bigger questions surrounding the future of the John Wick universe, what is Ballerina actually about? At its core, the answer is surprisingly simple. This is a revenge story, not a complicated revenge story, not one packed with mystery or layered motivations. Just a very direct, very personal mission that begins with a childhood tragedy and follows the consequences years later. The film opens with Eve as a young girl witnessing the violent death of her father. It's the kind of moment that immediately defines a character's future. Before she really has a chance to understand the world around her, that world is ripped apart. And from that point forward, the movie never lets you forget what is driving her. Everything traces back to that loss. Years later, after being taken in by the Ruska Roma organization, Eve grows up inside a system designed to transform people into weapons. She trains, learns, survives, and eventually becomes exactly what this world demands she become. But unlike many of the people around her, she's never fully moved on from the past. That old wound is still there. And honestly, one thing I appreciated is that the movie never tries to hide where the story is going. There isn't some huge mystery hanging over the narrative. You know what Eve wants. You know who she's looking for. You know what's waiting at the end of the road. The journey isn't about discovering the destination. It's about watching how much destruction happens before she gets there. That's where Ballerina feels very similar to the larger John Wick franchise. The setup is straightforward. Somebody suffers a loss. Somebody wants revenge. A lot of people get in the way. The difference here is that Eve's path feels a little more personal than procedural. She's not just chasing a target. She's chasing a piece of her childhood that was taken from her. At least, that's what the movie is aiming for. Whether that emotional angle fully lands is something we'll get into later, but the foundation itself is clear. Eve isn't fighting for money, status, or power. She's fighting because she believes there's unfinished business sitting at the center of her life, and that's really the engine that keeps the story moving. Every lead she follows, every rule she breaks, every warning she ignores eventually circles back to the same thing. The people responsible for her father's death are still out there, and she's unwilling to let it go. What I found interesting is that the film doesn't spend much time complicating that motivation. Some revenge movies constantly introduce new twists, hidden agendas, and shocking revelations. Ballerina mostly stays focused on the original objective. For better or worse, it remains committed to that single goal. That simplicity can be a strength. It gives the story momentum. There's never much confusion about why Eve is doing what she's doing. At the same time, it also means the movie is carrying a lot of responsibility on execution. When the premise itself is this straightforward, the audience isn't necessarily waiting to find out what happens. They're waiting to see how it happens, and that's an important distinction. Because Ballerina isn't trying to reinvent the revenge genre. It isn't presenting some radically different narrative structure. Instead, it takes a familiar setup and drops it into a world filled with assassins, secret codes, old alliances, and violent consequences. The result is a story that feels immediately recognizable from the very beginning. A young girl loses her father. Years pass, the pain remains, and eventually she decides she's done waiting. Everything that follows grows from that decision. One thing I was genuinely curious about going into Ballerina was whether it would actually add anything meaningful to the John Wick universe, or simply borrow its aesthetics and move on. Because let's be honest, once a franchise starts expanding, there's always that risk. Every new spin-off promises to show us a hidden corner of the world we've never seen before. Sometimes that's exciting. Sometimes it just makes the universe feel smaller. Ballerina lands somewhere in the middle. What the film does fairly well is continue exploring the parts of this world that have always been more interesting when they're hinted at rather than fully explained. The Ruska Roma, for example, were never exactly a mystery to fans of the franchise, but they've mostly existed on the edges of previous stories. Here, they move much closer to the center. We spend more time inside their system, their traditions, and their methods. Not enough to completely redefine what we know, but enough to make them feel like more than background world building. And I actually think the movie is at its strongest when it's doing that. Not because it suddenly becomes some deep, mythology-driven epic, but because it understands something the John Wick films have usually handled pretty well. Mystery can be more valuable than explanation. A lot of modern franchises make the mistake of answering every question. Where did this come from? Who started that? How does this organization work? Why does this rule exist? Eventually, the mystery disappears. Ballerina generally avoids falling into that trap. It expands the world without constantly stopping to deliver lectures about how everything operates. The movie trusts that most viewers already understand the basics and doesn't feel the need to hold their hand through every piece of lore, at least most of the time. There are moments where the film clearly wants to introduce new factions, new relationships, and new layers to the assassin ecosystem. Some of those additions work, some feel less convincing, particularly when the story starts dealing with long-standing agreements, rival groups, and the political arrangements connecting different organizations. The movie asks the audience to accept certain rules because they exist, not necessarily because they're fully developed, and that creates an interesting tension. The John Wick universe has always been built on a strange balance. It's detailed enough to feel real but vague enough to remain intriguing. Push too far in either direction, and the illusion starts to weaken. Sometimes Ballerina gets close to that line. There were points where I found myself thinking less about the characters and more about whether certain systems or alliances actually made sense. That's usually a sign that the world building has become slightly more visible than it should be. The best world building often works quietly. You notice it without actively thinking about it. Still, I do appreciate that the film isn't content with simply repeating familiar locations and familiar faces. It at least attempts to show different corners of this universe and suggests that there are stories happening beyond the adventures of one legendary assassin. Whether those stories are as compelling is another conversation entirely. But the effort is there, and honestly, that's probably one of the more important jobs this movie had. Not proving that Eve can carry a film, not proving that the action still works. Proving that the John Wick universe itself is large enough to support stories that aren't directly attached to John Wick. By the end of the movie, I wouldn't say the lore expansion is revolutionary. It doesn't completely reshape how we view the franchise. It doesn't unlock some hidden layer that changes everything. What it does do is widen the map a little. It opens a few new doors. It introduces a few new players. And it quietly asks whether there are more stories worth telling in this world, beyond the one we've been following for the last several films. Now here's where opinions on Ballerina really start to split. Because if you ask 10 people about the action, most of them will probably agree on at least a few things. The fight scenes are energetic. The stunt work is impressive. The movie knows how to put together a spectacle. The story, though, that's where the debate begins. For me, Ballerina feels like one of those movies where the screenplay is constantly caught between two different ambitions. Part of it wants to be a straightforward revenge thriller. The other part wants to be a larger chapter in an already established franchise mythology. Sometimes those two goals work together. Sometimes they seem to be competing for space. At its most basic level, the narrative is incredibly easy to follow. Eve wants revenge for her father's death. She discovers a path toward the people responsible. She follows that path no matter how dangerous it becomes. That's the movie. You can explain the entire premise in a couple of sentences. And honestly, there's nothing wrong with simplicity. The original John Wick wasn't exactly built around a complicated plot either. What made that film work was how effectively it executed a familiar idea. Ballerina takes a similar approach, but the execution feels more uneven. One moment, the movie seems completely focused on Eve's personal mission. The next, it starts introducing larger world-building elements, old agreements, secret rules, rival organizations, and franchise connections that pull attention away from the central story. It's not confusing exactly. It's more that the movie occasionally feels distracted. There were several points where I felt like certain ideas were introduced with importance only to fade into the background later. Not necessarily abandoned, but never explored as deeply as they initially appeared, and that creates an odd sensation while watching. The film keeps moving forward, but some narrative threads feel lighter than they should. Then there's the issue of predictability. I don't think Ballerina is trying to be a mystery. It isn't built around shocking revelations or elaborate twists. Most viewers will probably have a good sense of where things are heading fairly early on. The problem isn't that the story is predictable. The problem is that some of the emotional beats arrive exactly when you expect them to, and in exactly the way you expect them to. Very little catches you off guard. Again, that's not fatal. Plenty of good action movies follow familiar roads, but it does mean the screenplay has fewer surprises to lean on when the action slows down. The dialogue is another area where reactions will probably vary. There are moments that fit comfortably within the John Wick style: short exchanges, serious faces, people speaking as if every sentence should be engraved into stone. Sometimes it works, other times it feels a little stiff, a little too aware of how cool it's trying to sound. And because the movie takes itself seriously for most of its runtime, those weaker dialogue moments tend to stand out more. What I found most interesting, though, is that Ballerina often feels like a movie that went through multiple versions before reaching the screen. Not because of any specific scene, but because of the way certain story elements fit together. There are stretches where everything flows naturally. Then there are moments where the film feels like it's stitching together ideas that may have originally belonged to slightly different movies. It's hard to explain, but you can feel it occasionally. The narrative works. It gets from beginning to end without falling apart, yet there's a lingering sense that some pieces aren't fitting together as smoothly as they could. At the same time, I don't want to make it sound like the screenplay completely fails. It doesn't. The story does what it needs to do. It establishes motivation. It creates obstacles. It moves Eve through increasingly dangerous situations. It gives the action a reason to exist. The issue is that it rarely rises above that level. The screenplay serves the movie rather than defining it. And by the time the credits roll, you're probably not thinking about clever writing choices, unforgettable dialogue, or surprising narrative turns. You're remembering the action, which, depending on what you're looking for from a John Wick spin-off, might be perfectly enough. One thing I kept going back and forth on while watching Ballerina was how much of the movie is actually interested in its themes, and how much of it simply uses them as fuel for the next action sequence. Because on paper, there's more going on here than just revenge. Revenge is obviously the headline. It's the first thing you notice. The entire story begins with loss, and everything Eve does afterward can be traced back to that single moment from her childhood. Her father's death isn't just part of her backstory. It's the emotional engine driving the entire film. At least that's the intention. The interesting thing is that revenge isn't the only idea floating around beneath the surface. There are also recurring ideas about protection, about family, about people trying to shield others from violence while simultaneously living inside a world built on violence. Several characters spend a surprising amount of time warning Eve, redirecting her, or trying to stop her from making choices they believe will only create more suffering. And that's where the film becomes a little more complicated than its basic premise suggests, because revenge and protection don't naturally work together. One is about moving forward toward conflict, the other is about preventing it. You can feel the movie trying to balance those two ideas throughout the story, sometimes successfully, sometimes less so. The challenge is that Ballerina never stays still for very long. Whenever it starts exploring the emotional consequences of Eve's choices, another fight breaks out, another chase begins, or another body hits the floor. The momentum of the action frequently pulls attention away from the emotional side of the story. That's not necessarily a criticism. It's just the type of movie this is. The John Wick franchise has never been built around long dramatic conversations or deeply introspective character studies. Emotion usually exists as a foundation rather than the main attraction. But here's where I think Ballerina struggles a little more than some of its predecessors. I understand Eve's motivation. I understand why she's angry. I understand why she refuses to let go. What I wasn't always sure of was whether I felt those emotions alongside her. There's a difference. A movie can explain a character's pain very clearly. That doesn't automatically mean the audience experiences that pain with them. And for me, that's where the emotional connection occasionally felt distant, not absent, just distant. The film gives us the reason for Eve's grief. It gives us the trauma, it gives us the scars. But because the story moves so aggressively toward the next objective, it doesn't always allow those feelings enough room to breathe. As a result, some emotional moments land harder than others. There are scenes where you can feel the movie reaching for something deeper than action spectacle. Moments where it's trying to remind us that beneath all the violence is a person who's been carrying the same wound for years. Those moments work best when the film slows down and trusts them. Unfortunately, those moments don't always last very long, and that's probably why reactions to the emotional side of Ballerina are so mixed. Some viewers will connect with Eve's journey immediately because the central trauma is simple and relatable. Loss is universal. Grief is universal. Wanting justice after tragedy is something almost anyone can understand. Others may find themselves appreciating the idea of the emotional journey more than actually feeling it, which is a subtle but important distinction. By the end of the film, I wouldn't say Ballerina is emotionally empty. I don't think that's fair. The themes are there. The intentions are there. The emotional foundation exists. The question is whether the movie digs deep enough into those ideas before sprinting toward the next explosion, the next fight, or the next act of revenge. And honestly, that's something each viewer will probably answer differently. Let's talk about Eve for a minute, because I think this is where a lot of people's overall opinion of Ballerina is going to be decided, not by the action, not by the franchise connections, not even by John Wick, by whether or not you actually become invested in her. And that's a surprisingly tricky thing for the movie to pull off. On a basic level, Eve is easy to understand. Her motivation is crystal clear from the opening minutes. She experiences a traumatic loss as a child, spends years training inside the Ruska-Roma system, and eventually decides to go after the people responsible. You never have to wonder what she wants. The movie makes that very obvious. The challenge comes from everything beyond that, because understanding a character and connecting with a character aren't the same thing. I always think of it this way. Motivation gets a story moving, but personality is what keeps people emotionally attached. And throughout Ballerina, I found myself understanding Eve more than I felt connected to her. That's not entirely the character's fault. Part of it comes from the structure of the film itself. The story moves fast, very fast. Once Eve begins her mission, the movie becomes increasingly focused on momentum. One location leads to another. One fight leads to another. One clue leads to another. The narrative is constantly pushing forward. What that means, though, is that there aren't many opportunities for the audience to simply spend time with Eve outside of her objective. We learn what drives her. We learn what happened to her, but we don't always learn enough about who she is when she's not pursuing revenge. And that's where some viewers may struggle to fully invest in her journey. The most memorable action heroes often have little moments that make them feel human beyond the plot. Small habits, unexpected reactions, personal quirks, moments of vulnerability that aren't directly connected to the main mission. Ballerina occasionally hints at those layers, but it doesn't spend much time exploring them. Instead, Eve remains largely defined by her purpose. She's focused, determined, driven. And almost everything about her character flows from those traits. Now, to be fair, there are viewers who will actually appreciate that. Some people don't need extensive character exploration in a film like this. If the motivation works and the action works, that's enough. And I completely understand that perspective. But for others, the emotional investment never quite reaches the level the movie seems to be aiming for. You care about whether Eve succeeds because the story tells you why she wants revenge. You don't always care because you've become deeply attached to her as a person. That's an important difference. What's interesting is that the film repeatedly tries to create emotional weight around her decisions. Characters warn her. Characters question her choices. Characters attempt to redirect her path. The movie clearly wants us to feel the consequences of what she's doing. Sometimes those moments land. Sometimes they pass by so quickly that the next action sequence immediately takes over. And that's really the recurring theme with Eve's character throughout the film. The foundation is solid. The motivation is believable. The objective is clear. But the emotional connection isn't always as strong as the movie seems to want it to be. By the end, I felt like I knew exactly what happened to Eve. I knew why she was fighting. I knew what she was chasing. What I wasn't completely sure about was whether I truly knew her. And that distinction is probably why reactions to the character have been so divided. Some viewers will see a focused, revenge-driven protagonist, and that's all they'll need. Others will finish the movie wishing they had spent a little more time understanding the person behind the mission. Either way, Eve remains the emotional center of the film. Whether that center fully pulls you in is one of the biggest questions Ballerina leaves each viewer to answer for themselves. One of the most interesting conversations surrounding Ballerina has nothing to do with the action itself. It's the title, because the moment you hear the word ballerina, your brain starts creating expectations. Not necessarily about the story, but about the character, about the style, about how this film might distinguish itself from the rest of the John Wick universe. And honestly, that's where some of the most divided reactions come from. The idea sounds fascinating on paper. A trained assassin raised within the Ruska-Roma system, who also comes from a world associated with discipline, movement, precision, and performance. There's a lot you can potentially do with that concept. You immediately imagine a protagonist who approaches combat differently, a unique fighting style, different tactics, a different rhythm. Something that feels separate from what we've already seen. The problem is that once the movie gets moving, that distinction isn't always as strong as you might expect. For long stretches, Ballerina feels less like a completely new branch of the franchise and more like another John Wick story with a different lead character. Now, before anyone misunderstands me, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Some viewers will be perfectly happy with exactly that. They walk into a John Wick spin-off wanting more of the John Wick formula, more assassins, more gunfights, more creative violence, more impossible survival stories. Ballerina definitely delivers those things. The question is whether it delivers enough of its own identity alongside them. And I found myself thinking about that quite a bit throughout the film. There are moments where Eve feels genuinely distinct, not because she's doing radically different things, but because her approach to danger sometimes relies more on improvisation, resourcefulness, and adaptation. She's often forced to work with whatever is available around her. Those moments help. They give the character a personality separate from the franchise icon whose shadow hangs over the entire movie. But there are also stretches where the film feels very comfortable operating inside an already established template. Fight, recover, track a target, fight again, move to the next location, repeat. And when that happens, the ballerina, part of Ballerina, can occasionally fade into the background. I think that's why some viewers came away feeling slightly disappointed by the execution of the concept itself. Not because the movie fails as an action film, not because Eve fails as a protagonist, but because the title suggests a stronger thematic identity than the movie ultimately embraces. The ballet training exists, the Ruska-Roma connections exist, the symbolism exists. But they're often functioning as framing devices rather than actively shaping the experience moment to moment. It's almost as if the film introduces an intriguing idea and then gradually becomes more interested in being a John Wick movie than exploring what makes a ballerina assassin fundamentally different. Again, reactions will vary. Some audiences won't care at all. If the action works, the action works. End of discussion. Others will spend the entire movie waiting for the concept to evolve into something more distinctive. Something that separates Eve from every other assassin we've already met. For me, the truth probably sits somewhere in between. I don't think Ballerina completely wastes its central idea. But I also don't think it fully unlocks everything that idea could have been. The movie succeeds in introducing a new lead character. What it's less successful at doing is convincing you that the franchise couldn't have told this exact same story with a different title. And that's an important distinction, because when a spin-off enters an established universe, it doesn't just need to prove that it belongs there. It also needs to prove why it needed to exist in the first place. That's the challenge Ballerina spends most of its runtime wrestling with, and depending on your expectations, you'll either think it found its own identity, or came very close without completely getting there. Now, this is probably one of the most debated aspects of the entire film, and honestly, I can understand why. Because the discussion isn't really about whether Eve can fight. Nobody watching Ballerina is going to walk away thinking she isn't capable. The real question is how the movie chooses to present that capability, and that's where opinions start to split. One thing the film does differently from many action movies is that it doesn't treat Eve as an unstoppable force from the moment she enters a room. She gets hit, a lot. She gets thrown around. She gets overpowered. She makes mistakes. There are multiple moments where it feels like she's surviving by determination rather than complete control of the situation. Some viewers really liked that approach. For them, it made the fights feel more tense because victory never seemed guaranteed. Eve often looks exhausted, injured, and outmatched. You can see the physical toll accumulating as the story progresses. There's a vulnerability there, a sense that every confrontation costs her something. But other viewers had almost the exact opposite reaction. They felt that the movie occasionally undermines its own protagonist. After all, this is supposed to be a highly trained assassin who grew up inside the same world that produced some of the most feared killers in the franchise. So when she repeatedly struggles against opponents that the story tells us she should be able to handle, some people started questioning whether the film was giving her enough authority. It's an interesting balancing act. If Eve wins every fight effortlessly, audiences complain that she's unrealistic. If she struggles too much, audiences complain that she doesn't look skilled enough. Ballerina spends most of its runtime walking directly through that minefield. And I don't think every viewer is going to agree on where it lands. What I found interesting is that the movie often emphasizes resourcefulness over dominance. Eve isn't usually portrayed as the strongest person in the room. She's not necessarily the fastest either. Instead, she adapts, she improvises, she turns ordinary objects into weapons, she takes advantage of opportunities when they appear. She survives situations that seem impossible because she refuses to stop moving. That creates a slightly different type of action hero, not a force of nature, more of a problem solver. And in some of the film's best moments, that distinction actually works. You can see the movie trying to establish an identity for her that isn't simply female John Wick. Because let's be honest, that would have been the easiest thing to do. Copy the formula, change the lead, call it a day. Instead, the film at least attempts to give Eve her own approach to violence and survival. Whether it succeeds completely is another matter. There were definitely moments where I felt the movie was still trying to figure out exactly how powerful it wanted her to be. Some fights present her as incredibly capable. Others push her so close to defeat that it creates an odd inconsistency in how we perceive her skill level. And then there's another layer to this conversation: agency. Because in action films, strength isn't just about winning fights. It's about controlling your own story. It's about feeling like the protagonist is driving events forward rather than being carried through them. Most of the time, Eve feels active. She makes choices. She ignores warnings. She pushes deeper into danger because she wants answers. But there are moments where the film risks shifting attention away from her. And whenever that happens, you start wondering whether the movie fully trusts its own lead character. That's a difficult thing for any spin-off to avoid, especially when it's connected to such an iconic franchise. Still, by the end of the film, I think the most interesting thing about Eve isn't whether she's stronger or weaker than other action heroes. It's that audiences seem to have completely different interpretations of her. Some see a resilient survivor who earns every victory. Others see a character who never quite gets the opportunity to become as formidable as she should have been. And honestly, the fact that people are still arguing about that after the credits roll probably says a lot about how central this issue is to the entire movie. Regardless of where you land on the story, the pacing, or even the action itself, there's one thing that becomes clear pretty quickly. This movie rises or falls on Ana de Armas. That's the reality of a spin-off like this. She's not stepping into a brand new franchise where audiences have no expectations. She's stepping into a universe that's been associated with one actor for years. Whether fair or unfair, every new lead in this situation is automatically compared to what came before. And honestly, that's a difficult position for any actor. What I appreciated about Ana de Armas here is that she never feels intimidated by that challenge. From the moment Eve becomes the focus of the story, Ana commits fully to the role. She doesn't play the character as a copy of anyone else. She isn't trying to imitate John Wick's mannerisms or recreate Keanu Reeves' screen presence. That would have been a disaster. Instead, she approaches the role from a completely different angle. There's a sharper emotional edge to Eve, more visible frustration, more impatience, more rawness. Even when the character is standing still, there's a sense that she's carrying unresolved anger just beneath the surface. That energy helps distinguish her from the people around her. And physically, she absolutely throws herself into the movie. Whether she's running, fighting, falling, getting thrown through walls, or dragging herself through another impossible situation, there's never a moment where it feels like she's treating the action as secondary to the performance. The action and the performance are working together. That's important because this isn't the kind of film where an actor can simply rely on dialogue to carry a scene. A huge portion of Eve's character is communicated through movement, reactions, determination, and physical endurance. Ana handles that side of the role convincingly. Now, does that automatically mean everyone will love the performance? Not necessarily. One criticism that kept surfacing while watching the film is that Eve sometimes feels more defined by what she's doing than who she is. That's partly a screenplay issue, but it inevitably affects how people respond to the performance as well. An actor can only explore the material they're given, and there are moments where the film seems more interested in moving Eve toward the next fight than allowing Ana de Armas to explore additional layers of the character. As a result, some viewers may come away wanting more emotional depth from Eve, even if they appreciate the performance itself. It's a subtle distinction, but an important one. I don't think most criticisms are directed at Ana. They're directed at the limitations of the character's writing, because whenever the movie slows down long enough to give her an actual moment, she generally makes good use of it. There's also another challenge she has to overcome throughout the film: visibility. Not literal visibility, but narrative visibility. When you're surrounded by returning franchise characters, familiar mythology, and constant references to a larger universe, it's easy for a new protagonist to feel like a guest in their own movie. That never fully happens here. Even when other recognizable faces enter the story, Anna remains the center of attention. The film repeatedly returns to her perspective, her decisions, and her journey. That's harder to achieve than it sounds, especially in a franchise where audiences already have emotional attachments to other characters. What impressed me most, though, is that by the end of the film, the conversation isn't really about whether Ana de Armas can lead an action movie. That question feels answered. She can. The more interesting question is whether the franchise will eventually give her material that allows her to build an identity completely separate from the shadow of John Wick. Because those are two different challenges. One is proving you belong, the other is proving you can become indispensable. Ballerina successfully handles the first challenge. The second one still feels like a work in progress. But as a leading performance, Ana de Armas does more than enough to suggest that there's potential for much more if the series decides to continue following Eve's story. One thing Ballerina never really struggles with is having recognizable faces around its lead character. The moment the film was announced, most people immediately started asking the same question: who's coming back? Because that's one of the advantages and dangers of making a spin-off inside an established franchise. Audiences already have relationships with certain characters. The second those characters appear on screen, they bring years of history with them, and Ballerina leans into that pretty heavily. You can feel the movie using familiar faces as anchors. Not necessarily because the story always requires them, but because they help reinforce that this is still the same world audiences have been visiting for years. Ian McShane continues to do what Ian McShane always seems to do in this franchise. He walks into scenes, delivers a few lines, and somehow makes everything feel more important. There's a certain weight he brings to the role that doesn't require much screen time. The character feels established before he even speaks. That's one of those advantages veteran actors have. They can create presence without demanding attention. Angelica Huston has a similar effect. Every time she appears, the movie instantly feels more connected to the larger mythology. There's an authority to her performance that helps sell the idea of these long-standing traditions and institutions within the assassin world. Even when the script doesn't spend much time explaining things, she makes it feel like there's history behind every conversation. Then there's Gabriel Byrne. I actually thought he brought an interesting energy to the film because he avoids playing the villain as some constantly shouting, scenery-chewing threat. His presence is quieter than that, more controlled, more patient. Whether the character is fully developed is another discussion, but Byrne gives the role enough seriousness that he never feels completely disposable. Norman Reedus is a more interesting case, not because he's bad, quite the opposite actually. The issue is that he feels like a character the movie could have done more with. Every time he appears, there's a sense that the film has access to an intriguing personality, but never quite spends enough time exploring it. You keep expecting him to become more important than he ultimately does. And then there's Lance Reddick. His appearance carries a different feeling entirely, not because of anything happening inside the movie itself, but because audiences inevitably bring real-world emotions into those scenes. Seeing him again creates a layer of appreciation that exists beyond the narrative. For many viewers, those moments will probably resonate differently than they would have otherwise. But the broader challenge facing all of these supporting characters is actually pretty simple. How much space should they occupy? Because every minute spent with a returning franchise favorite is a minute not spent developing Eve. And that's a difficult balance. If you remove too many familiar faces, longtime fans may feel disconnected from the larger universe. If you include too many, the spin-off risks feeling dependent on nostalgia. Ballerina spends most of its runtime trying to find a middle ground between those two extremes, sometimes successfully, sometimes less successfully. There were moments where I genuinely appreciated the familiar faces because they helped maintain continuity. The world felt connected. The story felt like it belonged within the larger franchise. There were other moments where I found myself wondering whether the movie was relying on existing goodwill rather than creating new attachments. That's always the challenge with supporting characters in a spin-off. You want them to enrich the story without becoming the story. For the most part, Ballerina manages that balancing act reasonably well. The returning characters provide familiarity. The newcomers add fresh energy. And while not every supporting role receives the amount of development it probably deserves, the overall cast does a solid job of making the world feel populated by people who existed before Eve arrived and will continue existing after she leaves. That sense of a larger world has always been one of the franchise's strengths, and the supporting cast plays a major role in maintaining that illusion. All right, let's talk about the question that was hanging over this movie long before anyone bought a ticket. How much John Wick is actually in Ballerina? Because depending on who you ask, the answer is either too little or too much, and somehow both arguments make sense. Going into the film, I expected John Wick's presence to be fairly limited. After all, this is supposed to be Eve's story. That's the entire point of making a spin-off. The new character needs room to breathe, room to develop, and room to prove they can carry a movie without constantly standing next to the franchise icon. For a while, that's exactly what Ballerina seems interested in doing. John Wick exists in the background. His presence is acknowledged. The universe remains connected, but the focus stays where it should stay, on Eve, at least initially. What's interesting is that the conversation around John Wick in this movie isn't really about screen time. It's about function. Why is he here? What role is he serving? And does the story genuinely need him? Those questions become more important the longer the movie goes on, because there are moments where his appearance feels completely natural. The franchise has established this world already. Certain characters know each other. Certain organizations overlap. Certain events happen simultaneously. Seeing John Wick exist somewhere within that framework makes perfect sense. Nobody is questioning that. The debate starts when the movie begins asking more from his presence. At times, it feels like the film trusts Eve completely. Then suddenly John Wick reappears, and you can almost sense the movie checking in with the audience. Don't worry. He's still here, and that's where things become complicated, because every time John Wick enters a scene, something unavoidable happens. Attention shifts, not because the film wants it to, not because Ana de Armas isn't doing her job, but because Keanu Reeves has spent years building one of the most recognizable action characters of the modern era. You can't simply switch that off. The audience notices, the energy changes, the focus changes, the conversation changes. Suddenly viewers aren't thinking about what Eve is going to do next. They're thinking about John Wick, and that's a difficult thing for any spin-off to manage. In some scenes, his inclusion genuinely helps maintain continuity. He reminds audiences where this story exists within the larger timeline. He reinforces the connections between films. He strengthens the feeling that this isn't some detached side adventure happening in a separate universe. Those moments work, but there are other moments where his presence starts feeling less essential and more strategic, almost as if the movie isn't entirely confident that Eve can hold audience attention on her own. Now, whether that's actually true is a different discussion. The important thing is that the perception exists, and perception matters. A few times throughout the film, I found myself wondering how certain scenes would play if John Wick were removed entirely. Would the emotional impact change? Would the story still function? Would Eve's journey feel stronger or weaker? Those are interesting questions because a spin-off eventually has to answer them. At some point, the franchise needs to decide whether new characters can stand independently or whether they will always require the original hero standing nearby. That's really what Ballerina is wrestling with. Not whether John Wick is entertaining. Of course he is. Not whether Keanu Reeves is enjoyable to watch. Of course he is. The real issue is whether his presence helps Eve's story or occasionally overshadows it. And honestly, I think reasonable people can disagree on that. Some viewers will leave wishing there was more John Wick. Others will leave wishing there was less. Personally, I think the most successful moments in the film are the ones where Eve feels fully capable of carrying the narrative herself. Because that's the future this franchise is trying to build. Not a universe where every story eventually circles back to John Wick. A universe where characters like Eve become compelling enough that they don't have to. Whether Ballerina completely achieves that goal is debatable. But the fact that we're even having this conversation tells you how important John Wick's role is here. He's not just another supporting character. He's the measuring stick every spin-off in this franchise will be judged against. One of the more fascinating things about Ballerina actually starts before the movie itself. Because if you've followed the production at all, you've probably heard some version of the stories, reshoots, creative changes, different cuts, questions about the final direction of the film. At one point, it almost felt like the behind-the-scenes conversation was becoming as interesting as the movie. And honestly, that's never an ideal situation. Whenever a film becomes known for production troubles before audiences even see it, people start looking for problems. Every awkward scene gets blamed on reshoots. Every pacing issue gets blamed on rewrites. Every narrative inconsistency suddenly becomes evidence of behind-the-scenes chaos. Sometimes that's fair, sometimes it isn't. With Ballerina, you can occasionally feel traces of that complicated production history, but not always in the way people might expect. The film never completely falls apart. That's the first thing worth mentioning. For a project that reportedly went through substantial revisions, the finished product is surprisingly coherent. You can follow the story. The character motivations remain understandable. The movie never feels broken. Messy at times, sure. Broken? Not really. A lot of that discussion naturally leads to Len Wiseman, and I have to admit, his involvement was one of the biggest question marks going into the film, not because he's inexperienced, quite the opposite. He's been directing large-scale action projects for years. The concern was whether his style would blend naturally with a franchise that already has such a distinct identity. The John Wick films have developed their own visual language over time, their own rhythm, their own approach to action, their own atmosphere. Stepping into that environment isn't easy. What's interesting is that Ballerina rarely feels disconnected from the franchise. If someone walked into the theater without knowing who directed it, they'd immediately recognize it as part of the same universe. The visual approach, the action philosophy, the pacing of the set pieces, it's all operating within familiar territory. And that's both a compliment and a criticism depending on how you look at it. On one hand, Weissman successfully preserves the tone fans expect. On the other hand, there are moments where the film feels more committed to maintaining the franchise identity than establishing its own. Still, when the movie leans into action, the direction becomes considerably more confident. The staging is clear. The movement is easy to follow. The geography of the fights generally makes sense. And perhaps most importantly, the film understands something that many modern action movies still struggle with. Audiences need to see what's happening. That sounds obvious, but it isn't. Too many action films hide choreography behind frantic editing and shaky camera work. Ballerina usually avoids that trap. Even during chaotic sequences, there's an effort to keep the action readable. You can follow the movement. You can understand the space. You can appreciate the stunt work. That matters. Now, the production conversation becomes even more interesting when discussions shift toward Chad Stahelski's reported involvement. Because whenever the creator most associated with the franchise enters the conversation, fans immediately start speculating. Which scenes were changed? Which sequences were added? How much of the final movie belongs to one filmmaker versus another? The truth is, most viewers will never know, and honestly, that's probably fine. At the end of the day, audiences judge the finished product, not the production timeline. What matters is whether the final version works. For me, Ballerina feels like a movie that occasionally shows signs of multiple creative influences, but still manages to arrive at a recognizable destination. You can sense that different ideas may have existed during different stages of development. You can occasionally feel transitions that aren't perfectly smooth. You can spot moments where the film seems caught between competing priorities. But you can also see a production that ultimately found its footing, maybe not perfectly, maybe not consistently, but enough to deliver something that still feels like it belongs within the franchise. And considering all the conversations surrounding the movie before release, that might actually be one of its more impressive achievements. Because films with complicated productions don't always survive the process. Ballerina does. Whether it fully thrives is another discussion, but it definitely survives. Even people who walked away disappointed by Ballerina seem to agree on one thing: the movie looks good, really good actually. And that's important because the John Wick franchise has spent years building a very specific visual identity. At this point, audiences expect a certain level of style the moment they see the first frame: the neon lighting, the dark interiors, the carefully designed locations, the contrast between elegance and violence. It's become part of the franchise's DNA. So naturally, one of the first questions Ballerina has to answer is whether it can maintain that standard. For the most part, it does. The film immediately feels familiar. Not in a lazy way, but in a way that signals you're still inside the same cinematic universe. The visual language is recognizable from the beginning. Shadows dominate many scenes. Colors are often rich and controlled. Light isn't just illuminating spaces, it's helping create atmosphere. There are moments where entire sequences feel designed around mood first and action second. And honestly, I appreciated that, because lesser spin-offs often focus so much on recreating the mechanics of a franchise that they forget the aesthetics that made people care in the first place. Ballerina doesn't make that mistake. You can tell a lot of attention went into presentation. The cinematography consistently tries to make the world feel larger than life without turning it into complete fantasy. There are scenes that almost feel dreamlike, yet they remain grounded enough that you accept them as part of this universe. That's not an easy balance to maintain. The camera work deserves some credit as well. One thing I noticed throughout the film is how often the camera allows action to breathe. It doesn't constantly rush to hide impacts behind quick cuts. It generally wants you to see the movement, understand where characters are positioned, and follow the choreography. That's something the franchise has always done well. When a punch lands, you see it. When someone crashes through a wall, you see it. When a fight escalates into complete chaos, you still understand what's happening. That clarity makes a huge difference, because no matter how impressive a stunt might be, it loses value if the audience can't actually appreciate it. The lighting is another area where the film quietly excels. There are scenes where the lighting almost becomes a character of its own. Harsh shadows, glowing interiors, cold environments contrasted against bursts of violence. It all contributes to the mood the movie is trying to create. And while Ballerina may not contain the most iconic visuals in the franchise, it consistently understands the look it's aiming for. It never feels cheap. It never feels rushed. It never feels visually disconnected from the series around it. Even some critics who struggled with the story acknowledged the craftsmanship on display. That's usually a sign that the technical departments are doing their job exceptionally well. The visual effects also deserve a mention, though perhaps not for the reasons some people expect. They're effective largely because they don't constantly draw attention to themselves. Nothing takes you out of the experience. Nothing feels overly artificial. The effects exist to support the action rather than replace it, and that's exactly how they should be used in a movie like this. What I find interesting is that Ballerina often succeeds visually even during moments where the narrative is struggling. There were scenes where I wasn't completely invested in what was happening emotionally, but I was still engaged because the presentation itself remained compelling. That's a valuable skill for any action film. The ability to hold attention through atmosphere, composition, movement, and visual energy. By the end, I wouldn't say Ballerina reinvents the visual identity of the franchise. That's not really its goal. Instead, it preserves the style audiences expect, while occasionally finding its own touches within that framework. And in a franchise where visual presentation has always been a major part of the appeal, that's a pretty significant accomplishment. One thing that often gets overlooked when people talk about movies like Ballerina is how much of the experience depends on the world feeling believable. Not realistic, believable. There's a difference. Because let's be honest, the John Wick universe stopped pretending to be realistic a long time ago. This is a world where secret organizations operate in plain sight, assassins seem to be everywhere, and entire systems function according to rules that most ordinary people never even know exist. The reason it works isn't realism, it's commitment, and Ballerina understands that. The production design does a lot of heavy lifting throughout the film. Every location feels like it belongs within this strange parallel society that's been built across multiple movies. Whether we're inside training facilities, safe houses, hidden meeting places, or larger action environments, there's a sense that these places existed before the story arrived. That's important. Good production design shouldn't feel like a movie set waiting for actors to show up. It should feel like a living environment that happens to be hosting the events of the film. For the most part, Ballerina succeeds at that. The world feels inhabited, the spaces feel purposeful, the locations have personality. What stood out to me most was how the film continues one of the franchise's strongest traditions, turning environments into part of the storytelling. A hallway isn't just a hallway, a room isn't just a room, a village isn't just a village. They're opportunities, they're stages for conflict, they're pieces of visual storytelling. And that becomes especially noticeable as the movie moves toward its larger action sequences. The Alpine Village, in particular, ends up becoming one of the most memorable settings in the entire film. Not because it's the most visually extravagant location we've ever seen in the franchise, but because it feels distinct. The environment immediately creates a different atmosphere from the urban spaces that dominate much of the John Wick universe. There's something unsettling about it, something isolated, something that feels disconnected from the outside world. The movie uses that feeling effectively. Instead of simply serving as a backdrop, the location becomes part of the tension. You feel trapped there alongside the characters. You understand why it matters, and that's exactly what a strong setting should do. The costume design deserves some attention as well. Again, this is an area where the franchise already has a strong identity. Characters often dress with a level of style that borders on mythological. Even in the middle of absolute chaos, people somehow look like they stepped out of a fashion campaign for professional killers. Ballerina continues that tradition. The wardrobe contributes to the atmosphere without constantly demanding attention. It helps define characters, reinforce status, and maintain the sleek aesthetic that audiences associate with this world. Nothing feels out of place. Nothing feels disconnected from the larger franchise. And while costumes may not be the first thing viewers remember afterward, they're constantly contributing to the overall experience. The same goes for the set design. There's a level of detail throughout the film that helps reinforce the idea that these organizations have history. These aren't random rooms occupied for a single scene. They feel curated, designed, lived in. Whether it's through architecture, decoration, layout, or visual texture, the film consistently works to make its environments feel specific rather than generic. That's something a lot of modern action films struggle with. Too many movies take place in locations that immediately blur together. Warehouse, office, street, repeat. Ballerina generally avoids that problem. Its environments have identities. And because those environments are often tied directly into the action, they become memorable in a way that many action settings don't. By the end of the film, you may not remember every plot detail. You may not remember every line of dialogue, but chances are you'll remember certain locations, certain rooms, certain environments, certain visual spaces where major events unfolded. And honestly, that's one of the biggest compliments I can give a movie's production design. When the world itself becomes part of the memory, the filmmakers have usually done something right. Here's something I didn't fully appreciate until I started thinking back on specific scenes after the movie ended. A lot of what works in Ballerina wouldn't work nearly as well without the music. And that's one of those things audiences don't always notice while they're watching. You feel it more than you consciously recognize it. The John Wick franchise has always had a strong relationship with music. Not just background music, but rhythm, momentum, energy. The films understand that action isn't only about what's happening on screen, it's also about how the sound is pushing those moments forward. Ballerina continues that tradition pretty effectively. The score isn't constantly trying to overpower every scene. In fact, some of its best work happens when it's quietly building atmosphere in the background. It helps create tension before confrontations. It adds weight to certain locations. It fills the space between dialogue and violence without becoming distracting. That's harder than it sounds. A lot of action movies make the mistake of treating music like a volume competition. Louder equals better. Bigger equals more exciting. Ballerina usually avoids that trap. Instead, the soundtrack often feels synchronized with the mood the scene is trying to create. When the story slows down, the music allows those moments to breathe. When the action explodes, the score evolves with it. And when the movie enters its more stylish, visually driven sequences, the music becomes part of the atmosphere itself. There were several moments where I realized the soundtrack was doing a tremendous amount of work in maintaining momentum. Because let's be honest, not every dramatic scene in Ballerina is equally strong. Not every emotional beat lands perfectly. Not every conversation is unforgettable. But the music often helps smooth those transitions. It keeps the film moving. It maintains a certain energy level even when the screenplay isn't necessarily doing all the heavy lifting. That's a valuable contribution. The action scenes especially benefit from it. Good action choreography can create excitement. Great music can amplify that excitement. When both elements are working together, the result feels larger than the individual pieces themselves. And that's something Ballerina gets right fairly often. The score doesn't simply accompany the action. It helps shape the experience of watching it. There's also something very consistent about the sound of this universe now. Even when the movie introduces a different protagonist, a different story, and different locations, the music helps preserve that franchise identity. It reminds you that you're still operating inside the same cinematic world. That consistency matters, especially for a spin-off, because one of the challenges any spin-off faces is convincing audiences that it belongs alongside the films they already know. Visual style helps with that. Returning characters help with that. Music helps with that too, sometimes more than people realize. What I found particularly interesting is that some of my favorite musical moments weren't attached to the biggest action sequences. They appeared during smaller scenes where the soundtrack was quietly establishing mood rather than demanding attention. Those moments made the world feel larger, more immersive, more alive. And that's ultimately what good film music is supposed to do, not announce itself, not constantly ask for recognition, just quietly enhance everything around it. By the end of Ballerina, I wouldn't necessarily rank the soundtrack among the most memorable elements of the entire franchise. but I absolutely think it's one of the reasons the movie remains engaging even during its weaker stretches. It's doing more work than it gets credit for, and honestly, the best film scores often do, let's be honest. For a huge percentage of people buying a ticket to Ballerina, this is the section that actually matters. Not the lore, not the themes, not the emotional journey, the action. Because when a movie carries the words from the world of John Wick, audiences arrive with a very specific expectation. They want creativity, they want intensity, they want fight scenes that feel different from what most modern action movies are doing. And more importantly, they want action that earns comparison to the John Wick films. That's a ridiculously high bar. Yet somehow, Ballerina manages to clear it more often than not. Now, does it surpass the best action from the main franchise? For me, no, but that's not really a criticism. Very few action movies do. What impressed me was how committed the film is to keeping every major sequence visually distinct. One of the easiest traps an action-heavy movie can fall into is repetition. Fight, reload, fight again, repeat until the credits roll. Ballerina clearly understands that danger. So instead of relying on the same choreography over and over, the film constantly searches for new ways to create conflict. Different locations, different weapons, different obstacles, different approaches. The result is that the action rarely feels like it's running in place. A fight scene isn't memorable simply because people are punching each other. It's memorable because something about it feels unique. And Ballerina spends a lot of time chasing that uniqueness. One moment the movie is leaning into hand-to-hand combat. The next, it's turning ordinary objects into weapons. Then suddenly the film introduces grenades, flamethrowers, knives, firearms, or whatever else happens to be nearby. There's an almost playful creativity to the violence, not playful in a comedic sense. More in the sense that the filmmakers seem genuinely interested in asking, what's the most entertaining way this encounter could unfold? And that curiosity pays off. Several sequences stand out because they aren't just about who wins the fight. They're about how the fight is staged, how the environment is used, how the choreography evolves, how the momentum escalates. That's something the John Wick franchise has always done exceptionally well, and Ballerina clearly understands the assignment. Another thing I appreciated is the readability of the action. This sounds like a small detail until you watch enough modern action movies. Too many films cut every half second. Too many hide choreography behind shaky cameras. Too many confuse chaos with excitement. Ballerina generally trusts its stunt performers. It wants you to see the movement. It wants you to appreciate the choreography. It wants you to understand how one action leads into the next. And because of that, the fights feel more satisfying. You can actually follow them. You can watch the performers work. You can see the physical effort involved. That makes a huge difference. What's interesting is that the action also helps define Eve as a character. Not through dialogue, not through exposition, through behavior. Unlike some action heroes who dominate every situation through overwhelming skill, Eve often succeeds through adaptation. She improvises, she reacts, she finds opportunities inside chaos. That approach gives many of the fights their own personality. The action doesn't simply tell us that she's dangerous, it shows us how she's dangerous. And that's an important distinction. Now, if there's one criticism that kept appearing across reactions to the film, it's that the action occasionally carries more weight than the story around it. There are moments where the narrative feels like it's racing to catch up with the next set piece, almost as if the movie knows exactly what audiences came to see, and honestly, maybe that's because it does. The truth is, many viewers will remember individual action sequences long after they've forgotten specific plot details. They'll remember the inventive kills, the weapon choices, the larger confrontations, the escalating madness of the later acts. They'll remember how those scenes felt. And in a franchise built largely on action craftsmanship, that's not a small achievement. Whether you think Ballerina reaches the heights of the best John Wick films or not, one thing becomes difficult to argue. The movie understands what kind of franchise it belongs to. And when it comes to action design and choreography, it delivers exactly the kind of spectacle audiences were hoping to see. Now, before anybody decides whether Ballerina is for them, there's something that probably needs to be addressed honestly. This movie is violent, not action movie violent. Not a couple of shootouts and some fistfights violent. John Wick violent, and if you've seen the previous films, you already know that means we're operating on a completely different scale. The body count starts climbing early and never really slows down. People get shot, stabbed, burned, blown up, thrown through things, hit with things, and occasionally dispatched in ways that make you pause for a second and think, well, that was certainly creative. The interesting thing is that Ballerina doesn't treat violence as something shocking. That's an important distinction. The film isn't trying to disturb the audience in the way a horror movie might. It isn't lingering on suffering to make a statement about brutality. It isn't asking viewers to contemplate the consequences of every death. Instead, violence functions almost like a language within this universe. It's how characters communicate. It's how conflicts are resolved. It's how the story moves forward. And if that sounds absurd when spoken out loud, that's because it kind of is. But that's also been true of the John Wick franchise from the beginning. The movies exist inside a heightened reality where violence isn't merely an outcome. It's part of the entertainment design. Every fight is choreographed. Every encounter is staged. Every confrontation is treated almost like a performance. Sometimes literally. That's why reactions to the violence tend to vary so much. For some viewers, it's one of the biggest strengths of the film. They enjoy the creativity. They enjoy the escalation. They enjoy seeing how each sequence finds new ways to surprise them. The violence becomes part of the spectacle, part of the fun. For other viewers, it creates the opposite reaction. The sheer volume of killing eventually becomes exhausting. After a certain point, another body hitting the floor no longer carries much impact because the movie has already shown dozens of similar moments. And honestly, I can understand both perspectives. There were times where I found myself genuinely impressed by how inventive certain sequences became, not because they were realistic, definitely not because they were realistic, but because the filmmakers were constantly searching for fresh visual ideas rather than repeating the exact same formula. At the same time, there were moments where the film seemed almost determined to push excess as far as possible. More enemies, more weapons, more destruction, more chaos. Eventually, audiences reach a point where they either embrace that excess or begin disconnecting from it. There's rarely much middle ground. One thing I do think the movie handles effectively is consistency. It never pretends to be something it isn't. Ballerina doesn't suddenly stop and become a restrained thriller halfway through. It doesn't apologize for its brutality. It doesn't try to soften the edges. From beginning to end, it understands exactly what type of experience it's offering. Whether you enjoy that experience depends entirely on your tolerance for this style of action filmmaking. Because this isn't violence used sparingly. It's violence as spectacle, violence as choreography, violence as entertainment. And while that approach won't work for everyone, it is very much in line with the franchise's identity. By the time the film reaches its largest action sequences, the brutality has become so deeply woven into the experience that separating the violence from the movie itself becomes almost impossible. For better or worse, it's part of the DNA. It's one of the reasons fans show up. It's one of the reasons critics remain divided. And it's one of the reasons Ballerina feels unmistakably connected to the world it comes from. You may love it, you may hate it, but you'll never be confused about what kind of movie you're watching. At some point during Ballerina, every viewer has to make a decision, not about whether the movie is good, not about whether the action works, about how much action movie logic they're willing to accept. Because trust me, this film asks for a lot of it. Now, to be fair, that's hardly a new problem. The John Wick franchise stopped operating according to normal human rules years ago. The further the series expanded, the more it embraced its own heightened reality. Characters survive impossible injuries. Entire armies of assassins appear out of nowhere. People absorb punishment that would hospitalize ordinary humans for months and then continue fighting 5 minutes later. Ballerina absolutely continues that tradition. And honestly, it might push it even further in a few places. What's interesting is that the movie seems aware of how ridiculous some of its situations are. Not necessarily in a self-aware comedic way, but in the sense that it stops trying to convince you everything is realistic. Instead, it wants you to accept the rules of its universe and enjoy the ride. For some viewers, that's easy. For others, it's where the movie starts losing them, because there are moments where Eve survives things that would make most people immediately question what they're watching. She takes punishment, a lot of punishment, falls, impacts, injuries, situations that look absolutely devastating, and yet somehow she keeps moving, keeps fighting, keeps finding another way forward. Now some audiences see that as part of the fun. The entire appeal of this genre is watching extraordinary people accomplish impossible things. Realism isn't the point. The spectacle is the point. The myth is the point. The fantasy is the point, but other viewers approach it differently. They look at certain scenes and start asking questions. How is she still standing? How is that person still conscious? How did anyone survive that? How are these supposedly elite assassins making such obvious mistakes? And once those questions start appearing, the illusion becomes harder to maintain. One criticism that appeared repeatedly among reactions to the film involves the balance between Eve's experience level and her accomplishments. The movie presents her as highly trained, but not necessarily as the greatest assassin who has ever lived. Yet she often finds herself overcoming odds that seem almost impossible. Entire groups, overwhelming numbers. Enemies who theoretically should be just as dangerous as she is. For some viewers, that's exciting. For others, it stretches credibility too far. The funny thing is that both reactions are valid because the film exists in a strange space between grounded action and full action fantasy. It wants you to feel the pain of every fight, but it also wants its characters to survive things that no human realistically could. Those goals naturally conflict with each other. And Ballerina never completely resolves that contradiction. There were moments where I genuinely felt the physical exhaustion of the character. The movie does a decent job showing the cumulative damage she suffers throughout her journey. But then there were other moments where she seemed capable of pushing through injuries that felt almost superhuman. That's where suspension of disbelief becomes essential. You either accept the rules or you don't. The movie isn't particularly interested in negotiating. It's saying, this is the world. These are the rules. Come along if you're willing. And honestly, that's pretty much the same deal the John Wick films have been offering for years. The difference is that audiences often gave John Wick himself a little more room because the franchise repeatedly positioned him as a legendary figure. A myth, a boogeyman. Eve doesn't quite occupy that space yet, which means some viewers naturally scrutinize her achievements more closely. Whether that's fair or not is debatable, but it's definitely part of the conversation. By the end of Ballerina, realism is probably the wrong lens through which to judge the film. This isn't trying to be a realistic revenge thriller. It's trying to be a heightened action spectacle where determination, skill, and sheer refusal to quit can overcome almost anything. If you accept that premise, you'll probably have a great time. If you don't, the movie may start feeling less like an action film and more like a 2-hour argument with physics. And that's a battle no amount of choreography can completely win. If there's one thing Ballerina rarely allows itself to do, it's sit still. Seriously, this movie seems almost allergic to standing in one place for too long. The moment a scene starts settling down, something happens. A new lead appears, a fight breaks out, someone gets chased, someone gets shot, another location enters the picture. The movie is constantly pushing itself forward. And depending on what you're looking for, that's either one of its biggest strengths or one of its biggest weaknesses, because pacing is probably the area where audience reactions are all over the place. Some people came out of the film saying it flew by. Others felt every minute of the runtime. What's interesting is that both reactions make sense. From a pure event perspective, there's always something happening. The movie doesn't spend long stretches in conversation. It doesn't stop for extended character studies. It doesn't wander into side stories that completely derail the main objective. The narrative remains focused. Eve has a mission. She follows that mission. Obstacles appear. She overcomes them. The cycle continues. That structure creates momentum almost automatically. The problem is that momentum and engagement aren't always the same thing. A movie can move quickly while still feeling emotionally distant, and I think that's where some viewers struggled. The film is constantly advancing the plot, but not always advancing our connection to the characters at the same rate. There were moments where I found myself impressed by how efficiently the story moved from one set piece to another. Then there were moments where I realized the movie hadn't really slowed down long enough for certain scenes to fully land. It's a delicate balance. Slow down too much and audiences complain that the action disappeared. Move too fast and audiences complain that nothing has emotional weight. Ballerina generally chooses speed, almost every time. And honestly, that choice makes sense for this franchise. The John Wick series has always been built around momentum. Once the engine starts running, the films rarely stop to catch their breath. Ballerina follows that philosophy very closely. The action sequences play a huge role in maintaining that energy. In fact, there are points where the action feels responsible for carrying the pacing more than the story itself. Whenever the narrative threatens to lose momentum, another major confrontation appears and immediately restores the film's energy. That's part of why even some critics who disliked aspects of the screenplay still described the movie as entertaining. The action acts like a safety net. Whenever the story stumbles, the choreography pulls it back up. Now, the downside to that approach is repetition. When a film relies heavily on action to sustain momentum, it risks creating a rhythm that's a little too predictable. Travel, fight, recover. Travel, fight again, repeat. Some viewers won't mind that at all. Others may start noticing the pattern. And once you notice the pattern, certain stretches can begin feeling less exciting than they should. The final act is where this becomes especially noticeable. For some people, it's the strongest section of the movie because the action escalates dramatically and refuses to let go. For others, it's where the film starts feeling excessive. Not necessarily bad, just relentless. and relentless can be exhausting if you're not fully invested. Personally, I think the pacing works best when the movie balances urgency with atmosphere. When it allows a scene to breathe for a moment before launching into the next explosion of violence. Those quieter moments aren't always memorable, but they're important. They create contrast. Without contrast, non-stop action eventually starts feeling like background noise. Fortunately, Ballerina usually finds enough variation to keep things moving. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not consistently, but enough. Enough that even when the story isn't firing on all cylinders, the film rarely feels completely stagnant. And in a movie built around revenge, assassins, and escalating chaos, that ability to maintain momentum is probably one of its most valuable assets. Because whatever else you think about Ballerina, it certainly doesn't spend much time standing still. One thing I found surprisingly interesting about Ballerina is how seriously it takes itself. And I don't necessarily mean that as a criticism. It's more of an observation. Because if you step back and really think about what's happening in this movie, a lot of it is objectively ridiculous. We're talking about secret assassin organizations, endless waves of highly trained killers, impossible survival feats, flamethrowers showing up in major action sequences, and enough destruction to level a small neighborhood. On paper, this should feel completely absurd, yet Ballerina rarely treats any of it like a joke. The movie commits, fully. Every character behaves as though everything happening is completely normal. Nobody stops to point out how insane a situation is. Nobody delivers a wink to the audience. Nobody seems interested in breaking the illusion. And honestly, that level of commitment is part of what gives the franchise its identity. The John Wick universe has always operated with a straight face. Its world is strange, but the characters never act like they're inside a strange world. They accept it. Therefore, the audience is encouraged to accept it too. Ballerina follows that exact approach. For most of its runtime, the tone remains surprisingly consistent. Dark, serious, focused, purpose-driven. Eve isn't cracking jokes every few minutes. The villains aren't delivering lengthy comedic monologues. The film isn't trying to undercut dramatic moments with humor. It's interested in maintaining a specific mood, and it sticks to it. Now, some viewers absolutely appreciate that. Especially today, a lot of modern action movies seem terrified of sincerity. Every emotional moment gets interrupted by a joke. Every dramatic scene receives a sarcastic comment. Every serious conversation eventually turns into comic relief. Ballerina largely avoids that trend. When something dramatic happens, the movie lets it remain dramatic. When something violent happens, it lets the violence speak for itself. There's a confidence in that approach. At the same time, I can understand why some viewers found the film a little too serious. Because when a movie spends over 2 hours operating at the same emotional frequency, it occasionally risks becoming a bit emotionally flat. Not because the material is boring, because tonal variety can be valuable. Humor isn't important solely because it makes people laugh. Humor creates contrast. It allows dramatic moments to hit harder. It gives characters additional dimensions. It helps audiences reset emotionally before the next intense sequence arrives. Ballerina doesn't have much of that. What little humor exists tends to emerge naturally from situations rather than from deliberate jokes. Sometimes the sheer excess of the action becomes amusing. Sometimes the creativity of a fight scene makes you smile simply because of how far the movie is willing to go. But that's very different from the film actively trying to be funny. For the most part, it isn't, and that's where audience reactions become interesting. Some people describe the movie as fun despite its seriousness. Others describe it as humorless despite enjoying parts of it. Those opinions aren't actually contradictory. The film can be entertaining without being funny. It can be exciting without being playful. It can be enjoyable while maintaining a fairly stern expression throughout most of its runtime. That's essentially what Ballerina does. It chooses commitment over self-awareness, atmosphere over comedy, intensity over levity. Whether that's the right choice will depend entirely on the viewer. Personally, I think the tone generally fits the world the film is operating in. A lighter approach might have felt out of place, but there were definitely moments where a little more variety could have helped. Not because the movie needed jokes, because even the darkest stories benefit from occasional changes in rhythm. And rhythm, more than almost anything else, is what determines how a movie feels over 2 hours. Ballerina understands intensity. The question is whether it occasionally understands relief. That's where opinions start to differ. Now we get to what is probably the most unavoidable part of discussing Ballerina, the comparisons. Because let's be honest, this movie never had a chance of escaping them. The second you attach a spin-off to a franchise as successful as John Wick, audiences immediately start measuring it against everything that came before. Not just the story, not just the action, everything, and that's a pretty brutal standard, especially when you're following a series that spent years redefining what modern action movies could look like. So the question becomes simple. How does Ballerina stack up against the main John Wick films? For me, the answer isn't completely straightforward. What I can say immediately is that Ballerina absolutely feels like part of the same family. It looks like a John Wick movie. It sounds like a John Wick movie. The action is designed like a John Wick movie. There was never a moment where I felt like I was watching some disconnected imitation trying to copy the formula from the outside. The DNA is there. The challenge is that sharing the DNA isn't the same thing as reaching the same level, and that's where opinions start splitting apart. One of the most common reactions I've seen is people describing Ballerina as lesser John Wick. What's interesting is that phrase can be interpreted in two completely different ways. For some viewers, it's criticism. For others, it's still praise. Because even a weaker John Wick-style action film often delivers more creativity, more ambition, and more memorable set pieces than many action movies released throughout the year. That's what makes judging Ballerina so difficult. You're not comparing it to average action cinema. You're comparing it to one of the strongest action franchises of the last decade. The action itself probably comes closest to matching the main series, not consistently, not scene for scene, but often enough that the connection feels earned. There are several sequences throughout the movie where you can see exactly why audiences immediately associate it with the Wick universe. The choreography, the weapon choices, the escalation, the visual clarity, those elements feel familiar in the best possible way. Where the gap becomes more noticeable is the story. The original John Wick wasn't revolutionary because of its plot complexity. In fact, its plot was famously simple, but it understood something important. Simplicity only works when execution is exceptional. Ballerina follows a similarly straightforward structure, yet it doesn't always achieve the same emotional pull. Part of that comes down to Eve. Part of it comes down to the screenplay. Part of it comes down to the unavoidable fact that audiences have already spent years building a relationship with John Wick. That emotional history matters a lot. Another interesting difference is how each film handles its protagonist. John Wick often felt larger than life from the beginning. The franchise spent years turning him into a mythological figure. Every movie added another layer to that legend. Eve enters the story from a very different position. She's not a myth. She's trying to become one, and that creates a different dynamic. The audience isn't watching an established legend return to action. They're watching someone attempt to carve out her own place inside a world already dominated by legends. Some viewers found that refreshing. Others found themselves constantly comparing her journey to Wick's, and honestly, I don't think that's entirely fair, but it's inevitable. Every spin-off faces the same problem. No matter how much it wants to be judged on its own merits, audiences carry the original films into the theater with them. The comparison is built into the experience. What's interesting is that Ballerina occasionally benefits from those comparisons as much as it suffers from them. When the action works, people immediately connect it to the best elements of the franchise. When the story struggles, people immediately compare it to the stronger emotional moments from earlier entries. It's a double-edged sword. The franchise identity gives the movie credibility. The franchise identity also raises expectations. By the end, I don't think Ballerina surpasses the best films in the series. I don't think it was ever realistically going to. What it does achieve is something slightly different. It proves that a movie can exist inside this universe and still deliver an experience that feels recognizably John Wick even when John Wick isn't the central focus. Whether it's as good as the main films is a separate debate. Whether it belongs alongside them is a much easier question to answer. And for me, the answer to that question is yes. There's one aspect of Ballerina that I don't think gets discussed enough, and that's where you watch it. Because honestly, this feels like one of those movies that changes depending on the size of the screen in front of you. Now, I'm not saying the film suddenly becomes a masterpiece in a theater or falls apart at home. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that Ballerina is built like a theatrical experience. You can feel it, the scale of the action, the sound design, the visual presentation, the way certain sequences are staged. A lot of the movie is clearly designed to overwhelm your senses a little. And that's something that naturally works better when you're sitting in a dark room with a giant screen and speakers powerful enough to shake your seat. I noticed this especially during the larger action scenes. When you're watching at home, your attention is divided whether you realize it or not. The phone is nearby. Notifications exist. You can pause whenever you want. You can grab a drink, answer a message, or check something online without missing much. The theater removes those options. You're trapped with the movie. And for a film like Ballerina, that's actually a huge advantage. Because this isn't really a movie that asks you to carefully analyze every line of dialogue or unravel a complicated mystery. It's a movie that wants to grab you and drag you through an experience. The larger the presentation, the easier that becomes. The visuals benefit from it. There are several locations throughout the film that feel more impressive when they're allowed to fill your entire field of vision. The lighting, the environments, the scale of certain confrontations, those details naturally become more impactful when they aren't compressed onto a smaller screen. The action benefits even more. Good action choreography is about movement, about spatial awareness, about seeing how characters interact with their environment. The larger the image, the easier it becomes to appreciate all those little details. You notice the stunt work more. You notice the choreography more. You notice the creativity of the sequences more. At home, those things still work, but they don't always hit with the same force. The sound might be the biggest difference of all. Ballerina relies heavily on impact, gunshots, explosions, crashing bodies, music swelling underneath the action. The movie wants those moments to feel physical. When you're sitting inside a properly equipped theater, they often do. At home, unless you have an incredible setup, some of that power naturally disappears. Now, to be fair, not every part of the film benefits equally from the theatrical environment. The story remains the story. The character work remains the character work. If certain narrative issues bother you in a theater, they'll still bother you at home. A bigger screen doesn't magically solve screenplay problems. What it does do is maximize the strengths. And Ballerina is very much a strengths-driven movie. The spectacle becomes bigger. The action becomes louder. The atmosphere becomes more immersive. The energy becomes harder to ignore. That's why I think reactions to this movie may actually shift depending on where people experience it. Someone watching casually at home might focus more on the plot weaknesses. Someone watching in a packed theater might be too busy enjoying the spectacle to care as much. Neither reaction is wrong. They're simply different experiences. At the end of the day, Ballerina feels like a film designed with theaters in mind, not because it can't work at home, because its biggest strengths happen to be the exact things that large format viewing amplifies. The action gets bigger. The sound gets bigger. The world gets bigger. And when a movie's primary goal is delivering an adrenaline-fueled action experience, bigger usually helps. A lot. Number topic 24. Overall reception and franchise future, and after all of that, the action, the violence, the world building, the comparisons, the expectations. Where does Ballerina actually land? Honestly, that's where things get interesting. Because this is one of those movies where the overall reaction feels surprisingly balanced, not universally praised, not universally disliked. Instead, it exists in that strange middle ground where people often agree on what the movie does well but disagree on how much those strengths outweigh its weaknesses. Almost everyone seems to recognize the same core reality. The action works, Ana de Armas works, the movie looks good, the franchise identity remains intact. Beyond that, opinions start spreading in different directions. Some viewers see a worthy expansion of the John Wick universe. They appreciate the new protagonist, enjoy the action set pieces, and come away excited about the possibility of more stories centered around Eve. Others enjoy the movie while still feeling that something is missing. Maybe it's stronger character development, maybe it's emotional depth, maybe it's the absence of John Wick as the central figure. Whatever the reason, they leave entertained but not completely satisfied. And then there are viewers who never fully connect with the film at all, not because it's poorly made, because they constantly compare it to the franchise's highest peaks. That's an incredibly difficult standard to overcome. What fascinates me most is that Ballerina almost feels like two separate tests happening at the same time. The first test is whether the movie succeeds on its own terms. The second test is whether the John Wick universe can continue growing beyond its original hero. Those aren't the same question. A film can be enjoyable and still fail to justify future spin-offs. A film can have flaws and still prove that the universe has room to expand. Ballerina ends up sitting somewhere between those outcomes. It doesn't completely redefine the franchise. It doesn't dramatically elevate the mythology. It doesn't suddenly become the best entry in the series, but it does accomplish something important. It proves that audiences can spend 2 hours following someone other than John Wick and still get a recognizable John Wick experience. That matters, especially if the franchise intends to continue exploring new characters and new stories. The future of Eve is probably the most intriguing part of that conversation. Because regardless of how people feel about this specific film, there seems to be a fairly common belief that the character has potential, a lot of potential. The question isn't whether she can carry action scenes. We've already seen that. The question is whether future installments can give her stronger stories, deeper emotional material, and enough space to fully step out of John Wick's shadow. If that happens, the franchise could have something genuinely valuable. If it doesn't, future spin-offs may continue fighting the same battle Ballerina spends most of its runtime fighting, the battle for identity. As for the franchise itself, Ballerina also raises a broader question. How far can this universe expand before it starts feeling stretched? That's something every successful franchise eventually has to confront. More stories aren't automatically better stories. Expansion only works when new additions bring something meaningful to the table. Ballerina doesn't completely answer that question, but it does keep the conversation alive, and maybe that's enough for now. At the end of the day, I think Ballerina succeeds more often than it fails. Not perfectly, not consistently, but enough to justify its existence, enough to entertain, enough to make future installments feel possible rather than unnecessary. And in a franchise built on survival against impossible odds, maybe that's actually a fitting outcome. So after everything, after the action, the world building, the comparisons, the expectations, and all the debates surrounding whether this spin-off should even exist, we arrive at the big question: was Ballerina worth making? And honestly, I think the answer depends on what you expected from it. If you walked in hoping for a film that would completely reinvent the John Wick formula, you're probably going to leave disappointed. Ballerina isn't trying to tear down the foundation and build something entirely new. It operates very comfortably inside the framework that already exists. But if your goal was to spend more time in this universe and see whether another character could carry that weight, the movie becomes a lot more interesting. Because despite all its flaws, Ballerina does accomplish something important. It proves that the John Wick universe isn't completely dependent on one character. Now, that's not the same thing as saying Eve is already as iconic as John Wick. She's not, very few action characters are, but the film gives enough evidence to suggest that there may be room for stories beyond the franchise's original centerpiece, and that's probably the biggest takeaway. The reaction to Ballerina has been fascinating because people often agree on the strengths while disagreeing on their importance. Most viewers seem to appreciate the action. Most viewers acknowledge Ana de Armas' commitment to the role. Most viewers recognize the production quality. Where opinions start separating is when the conversation moves toward the story, the emotional depth, and whether the film truly establishes its own identity. Some people see those shortcomings as minor issues. Others see them as major limitations. That's why the movie has generated such varied reactions. It's not a film that inspires complete consensus. It's a film that asks viewers what they value most in a franchise like this. Do you prioritize action, story, characters, world building? Because your answer to that question will probably determine your final opinion. What's encouraging is that even many of the film's critics seem to agree that Eve has potential, a lot of potential. In fact, some of the most common criticisms aren't about the character herself, they're about the material surrounding her. The feeling that there are still unexplored directions the franchise could take with her story. That's actually a good problem to have. It's much harder to continue a series when audiences reject the central character entirely. Here, the conversation feels different. It feels less like, this doesn't work, and more like, this could work even better. That's a meaningful distinction. As for the future of the franchise, Ballerina feels like a test run. A proof of concept, an experiment designed to answer a very specific question: can the John Wick universe survive expansion? I don't think the film provides a definitive answer. But I do think it provides enough evidence to keep asking the question, because at the end of the day, Ballerina succeeds more often than it fails. Not every story beat lands. Not every character gets enough development. Not every franchise connection feels necessary, but the movie delivers enough entertainment, enough spectacle, and enough promise to justify its existence. And sometimes that's all a spin-off really needs to do. Leave audiences interested in what comes next. Whether Ballerina becomes the beginning of a larger future for Eve or simply remains an interesting side chapter in the John Wick saga, it manages to accomplish something many spin-offs never do. It gives people a reason to keep talking about where the story could go from here. And for a franchise built on surviving impossible odds, that feels like a pretty fitting place to leave things.